we've given him the invitation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem. This officially starts our budget work sessions, and today we're going to present to you the 2022-2026 five-year capital improvement program, as well as a discussion or presentation on the proposed revenue projections for the next fiscal year. And I'm going to turn it over to Ken Hunter, our assistant to the city manager for budget and evaluation, to lead us through the presentations.
Thank you, Madam City Manager, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to start off by thanking and introducing the two individuals here to my left, who are our management analysts, who are heavily involved, along with all of our department heads and many of our department staffs, in preparing the budget. Chase Norwood and Kiana Walston, who have worked very well over this past year, very hard over this past year on a variety of projects, but obviously the preparation of the CIP and budget are significant to their involvement with the city. So I want to thank them, as well as all of our department heads, as well as department staffs who are involved in working with departments, as well as also the assistant city manager and the city manager for their leadership and guidance throughout this process. So the first thing we are going to do is do a review of the proposed 2022-2026 capital improvement program. In late March, we provided council with this notebook that included all the projects in our CIP as of that time. We were scheduled to present that CIP to council on March 28th, and due to some severe weather situations, we had to postpone that meeting, and unfortunately we're not able to reschedule it. So what you will be seeing today is a summary of what is covered in the CIP document. There are some changes that have been made with respect to funding in certain projects. Some of it's due to actions that were taken by council, others due to budgetary constraints. And the updated information regarding how much we are funding projects in fiscal year 22 is located in section 7 of your budget workbook under the tab CIP. So that is where the updated information is, and that information is reflected in the line items for the proposed budget. So the information that you will see in these slides that I'm about to present corresponds to the information that we have provided in the proposed budget. So we'll go ahead and start off with a summary of the budget, of the CIP, over the next 5 years in general government operations, we are proposing about $77.9 million in projects. This covers 103 projects, and this covers all aspects of general government, including facilities operated by the city, fleet, IT and communications, transit operations, police, fire, public works, parks and recreation, as well as surface transportation. In fiscal year 2022, our proposed capital budget is a little over $18.3 million, encompassing 59 different projects. With respect to our enterprise utilities of electric, gas, water, sewer, and stormwater, we are looking at about $79.67 million in projects over the next 5 years that involve 99 projects. And of that, about $12.65 million is scheduled in fiscal year 2022 as proposed. About 52 of those projects we're looking at action on in the coming fiscal year. So for a grand total, combining both general government and enterprise utilities, for the 5-year period, we're about $157.58 million, or 202 projects over 5 years. And in fiscal year 2022, we're looking at about $30.97 million spent across all operating funds for 111 projects. And there are full detailed descriptions of these projects in the CIP notebook that you have there with you. And then the summary, the updated financial information is provided in the tab 7 of the budget workbook. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the revenue distribution for these CIP projects. We have a variety of revenues that we use for it, many of which are current revenues that are derived from a variety of sources, including our general fund, our enterprise funds, the annual allocation we received from the state through the PAL Bill program, as well as grants we receive at the federal and state level. And a lot of that grant money, both federal and state, is tied to surface transportation, but it is also tied to other projects. We also have the revenue, which is dedicated to surface transportation improvements from the increase in our vehicle permit fee, which we instituted about 5 years ago. There's also possibility for other local funds, use of fund balance, and some other funds, other sources of financing, other sources of revenue. And then obviously we have financing. And all the financing that we are proposing in this CIP is from our annual use of installment purchase. So as you see here, again, our total CIP is a little under 157.58 million. About 24.5 million of that is derived from the general fund, of which about 4.95 is allocated this current fiscal year. 42.8 million for the 5 years is from the enterprise funds, of which 7.78 is allocated this year. A little under 9.8 million from the PAL Bill allocation, of which in proposed we're looking at about 1.95. About $9.7 million in federal grants, of which 321,000 is this year, and pretty much that's related to transit operations. 7.1 million from state grants, about $1 million of that allocated this year. The vehicle permit fee is pretty flat at $400,000 over 5 years, about $800,000 a year. And as you can see, and then also the last one I'll mention is with respect to financing, about $47.9 million in financing over the next 5 years, of which 10.97 million is allocated or appropriated for fiscal year 2022. And the reason for the bump in financing is for two reasons. Number one, we've been very conservative with our use of installment financing, particularly in general government operations over the last several years. And we are at a point now, especially this current fiscal year, where we heavily limited the use of installment financing because we were not sure with respect to where we would be in terms of the results, the impact of the COVID pandemic. And we are now in a position where we have several significant projects in our general government operations, and we'll talk about those, that definitely are amenable to financing, including one project in particular that's over $4 million project, and that's Fire Station 2. And so we definitely recommend some significant financing projects this coming fiscal year. And that also, we also, of course, have some projects in the utilities. With respect to general government expenditures, there are a lot of different components of operations in general government, and this is an overview of those. The largest one is at the bottom, and that's surface transportation. Part of our CIP approach is that any expenses that we have that are tied to surface transportation improvements, we go ahead and put in the CIP. So that's, of course, a combination of the funds we get from PAL Bill as well as other allocations that we receive from the vehicle permit fee, as well as any specific federal and state grants that go to surface transportation improvements. One of the changes that we made this year, this current fiscal year, and it was in response to ensuring compliance with state statutes regarding our utilization and recovery of the PAL Bill allocation, is that we moved the funds that we collected through the vehicle permit fee back to the general fund. For several years, we've been transferring those funds into the PAL Bill fund from the general fund, and there was a budget amendment that you approved several weeks ago that moved that money back into the general fund. So one of the things you'll notice with the annual operating budget is we now have our surface transportation funding appropriated in two separate areas. There's an appropriation in a new division in Public Works called Surface Transportation, and then there's the appropriation that's tied to the use of PAL Bill funds. So that's had to be split, and that has been done to ensure that we don't have any future compliance issues with respect to PAL Bill allocations. Facilities, going back to the top with facilities, over the next 5 years, we're looking at about $8.7 million in spending, of which $3.4 million is scheduled in fiscal year 22. You see the information for the Douglas block. And with respect to the Douglas block, it is the ongoing maintenance and improvements to the Douglas block buildings, which are now owned by the city. Fleet, we're looking at $15.3 million, and this is all encompassing of general government fleet operations, which includes all the vehicles for all the departments that are part of the general fund, including the fire and police department. So this is an effort that we're trying to make to better manage our fleet. So we've moved all of those vehicle and equipment purchases into a single section of the CIP so that we can properly budget it. And for many of our departments, in fact, for all of our departments, we use we try to do our best to score and properly evaluate the need to replace vehicles and heavy equipment. IT and communications is about $6.34 million, of which $1.23 is scheduled in fiscal year 22. You can see the information for the other departments that are there as well. Of course, again, totaling just a little over $77.9 million over the next 5 years, with 18.3 scheduled in fiscal year 22. This is the information with respect to our enterprise utilities. And we continue to work with our enterprise utility departments to ensure that all of that we have sufficient funding available for all the necessary upgrades and improvements necessary to maintain efficient and sustainable and quality services to all of our residents and business owners and others who are utility customers. Total over the next 5 years, again, in enterprise utilities, about $79.67 million, of which $12.65 million is budgeted in fiscal year 22. And the two largest shares of that over the next 5 years are in the areas of electric and sewer, which has been pretty consistent. You will notice also stormwater at $15.15 million. A significant share of that is tied to the multi-year plans for improvements to the downtown drainage system, which is our highest priority in the stormwater management operations. So what I want to do now is talk about some projects specifically that are included for funding in the fiscal year in the city manager proposed fiscal year 2022 budget. The largest project that we have from a financial perspective is the replacement of Station 2. This is part of a larger project that we have over the next several years for fire station realignment, but the first significant phase of that is Fire Station 2. Fire Station 2 was built in the early to mid-1960s. It is, of course, one of our oldest fire stations, and it is no longer in a condition or in a position to be an effective fire station. And it is simply put that we need to replace this facility. Our plans are to replace it on the existing site so that we can continue to provide the necessary services to the residents and businesses and other property owners in the given area. And that will be to build a modern station that can meet our needs in the present as well as long term. The estimated cost for construction as well as for all the other work that will need to be done for this facility is about $4.1 million, and this would be a financed project. And the idea is to have a station that can last 40 to 50 years. Our next significant program, of course, is up there on an annual basis, and that's our resurfacing program. We remain dedicated to continuing to making sure that we do annual resurfacing. We have a significant project of over $4 million that's almost in the process of being completed. We are annually budgeting about $1.6 million. Half of that comes from the PAL bill, and the other half comes from the vehicle permit fee. We also have $1.5 million budgeted for continuing improvements to the administrative service complex. You've seen the improvements we've already made at the first floor, as well as other improvements that have been made to the second floor. We will continue with the improvements necessary to the first floor. And the key improvements that you will see in this phase of the project will be relocation. The plan is for human relations to move upstairs, if I'm correct, for human resources then to expand into some of the space that's been previously occupied by human relations, and for space that's currently human relations to also be converted into a training space that will also be able to provide an expanded area of space for emergency operations. Our current emergency operations site is rather small, and we need to be able to have having a much larger space. There is upfit that's required with that for respect to technology and equipment, and so we will be relocating the space to this location as part of this development. $1.3 million is there with respect to facility roof replacement, and this is part of a multi-year program that we've had that's done roof replacements at the Senior Center and South Rocky Mount Community Center. And the next one is the Imperial Center. It is a project that we are looking to secure funding for through a congressional earmark. We submitted this project for consideration for earmark funding through Congressman Butterfield's office, and it made his finalist list of projects that he will be advocating for with Congress as they move through the appropriations process in the coming months. So this project, we are hoping to secure direct federal appropriations to be able to continue. We made the argument that due to the significance of this facility historically, as well as the fact that it is our primary facility locally for the delivery of arts and science-related enrichment and educational programs, was essential to the ongoing well-being and quality of life of the community. And that was received very well by Congressman Butterfield's office, so we're moving forward with that. And we'll also begin to have discussions with Senator Tillis's office, because they're moving forward as well with receipt of earmark applications. A little under $1.1 million is tied for information technology improvements. There are several different improvements in this area, and many of these have to do with hardware and back-end support. It also has to do with security, software upgrades, as well as the funding of a mobile application to provide direct service to our citizens with respect to public safety. And we've talked about that a little bit as well, and you'll have a chance to see an example of that during a demonstration during our June 2nd meeting, our June 2nd work session. $1,034,000 is for improvements to our Business Services Center. This includes roof replacement as well as other interior improvements that need to be made to the facility. We're currently working on the AC at this facility, as well as other improvements related to being able to ensure quality of service once we reopen following the COVID suspension. $719,000 is for heavy rolling stock replacement. This is primarily for heavy equipment in our Public Works Department. $717,000 is for the next phase, or the next annual installment of sidewalk improvements, which are funded in large part, about 80%, from congestion mitigation and air quality funds. These are our ability to expand our sidewalk network, primarily with the support of the federal and state government. As we've talked about before, $700,000 in the CIP is tied to restoration of Unity Cemetery. $600,000 is tied to police vehicle replacement. This was an expense that we suspended and deferred last year, or this current fiscal year, due to COVID. $500,000 is tied to renovations and improvements to the Denton Street Pool. Again, these will be scheduled to take place in the off season after this summer. The pool is in condition that it can be operated this current summer, and the improvements will be made after the end of the current summer season. And $400,000 is for the development and construction of recreational facilities, including a community center in the Battleboro community. Continuing with general government, we have $358,000 for improvements to our city warehouse. This includes the installation of a backup power system, as well as other necessary upgrades to the building. It's one of the older buildings that the city owns. I think it was originally built in the 1920s, if I remember correctly. We also are going to be doing some improvements to the employee offices in the facility. About $340,000 is tied. This is an annual appropriation for maintenance associated with Tar River Transit operations, and this is 80% federally funded. $325,000 is for general government light-duty vehicle replacement, and that replacement is based on an evaluation that we make of all of our light-duty vehicles. We score those vehicles, and in the highest priorities are scheduled for replacement, and we do that scoring typically in July to be as up-to-date as possible prior to acquisition. $290,000 is tied to bike route projects, I believe most of which are here in the central city and into the east of the central city. $225,000 is for the first phase of the Depot Park development. As you are aware, the city assumed ownership of the Depot area, which is in the northwest corner of downtown, and our intentions are to develop it into a passive park and cultural space. This will cover the first phase. Our hope is, of course, first is to do some planning, to have an inclusive process for the design and development of a plan for what the park will look like, as well as hopefully then to also do work on the rehabilitation of the depot structure itself. $200,000 is tied to corridor improvements. We, of course, as council knows, we've had several corridor studies that have been done in recent years. And while we are still working on trying to achieve significant primary funding for these programs from the state, we will look to utilize this funding to try to implement some improvements that can be done with city funds to main corridors within the city. Also, $200,000 for the continuation of our dirt street paving program, $200,000 for the first steps in the development of the Moncton Mill Trail, $150,000 for this is an annual allocation of improvements to our radio systems, $135,000 for capital improvements to the event center, and this is a new allocation. As the event center continues to grow and prosper in its development, there becomes a need to budget funds for ongoing improvements. Part of it is repair of the facility, but there's also the need to look at equipment, to look at other needs of the facility. We've worked with the event center management on developing a plan for how those improvements will take place over the next several years, and this is the first aspect of it, about $135,000. $120,000 tied to additional improvements to our fire stations, which includes improvements to security systems. And in the last one there, in regards to the National Guard Armory, $110,000. About $10,000 of that is for ongoing maintenance, and $100,000 is to move forward with a planning and development process to determine the future use of the facility. And it is our intention to develop a plan that's very inclusive with respect to the interests of the citizens, as well as evaluating the feasibility of what the facility can be used for moving forward in the future. The evidence storage facility project that is mentioned in the original CIP is not part of this proposed CIP, and our intentions as we move forward is to look at what really can be the future use of this facility outside of what had been proposed earlier. With respect to our enterprise utilities, this is in order of cost, so it kind of goes back and forth between the various utilities. The first project, the most significant from a standpoint of cost that we have coming up in fiscal year 22, is the Old Mill Road Pump Station. This is a pump station that services a significant growing area of the community and has been identified as a need to increase its capacity to meet with future growth. This project will be a 2-year project, and the first phase of this project is scheduled in fiscal year 22 at an estimated cost of about $1.4 million. The next project involves a transformer replacement at Substation 10, and the estimated cost of that is about $1.15 million. The next project, Springfield Road Widening, as you know, we are responsible for certain shares of cost with the North Carolina Department of Transportation with respect to utility relocations along their road projects inside the city. This ties in water and sewer and is about $900,000 combined between the two utilities. We have about $715,000 in stormwater equipment replacement that needs to take place, as well as $715,000 with respect to electric equipment. And these are heavy vehicles that we use for the delivery of these utility services. $650,000 has been budgeted between water and sewer for the continued replacement of meters to implement automated meter reading on our water and sewer systems. Electric and gas already have automated meters. This is to be able to catch up with respect to water and sewer. $525,000 is ongoing programs with respect to pole replacements and system improvements along our electric distribution system. $521,000 is tied to the downtown drainage improvements, and a lot of this is tied to planning as well as land acquisition costs in the coming year. There will be some significant increases in those costs moving forward in fiscal years 23 and beyond, and that is a project that we have targeted significantly for federal support. There are grant programs available that we're primarily looking at that can cover a significant amount of cost, and we are looking at other avenues to the federal government to gain support for this project as well. $500,000, and this it is scheduled for funding in fiscal year 22, but we will see what happens, is the utility coordination associated with the construction of the Sunset I-95 interchange. $500,000 is a new project in electric for the replacement of distribution, it's an ongoing project for the replacement of transmission poles. $300,000 is for water system enhancements to the northern end of the system. And $300,000 in electric is tied to the relocation of a generator at the CenturyLink complex here downtown. And that concludes this portion of the presentation.
Any questions, comments, guidance from the council regarding the presentation and what's proposed for the CIP?
Well, as you can expect, I have quite a few questions and observations. I wish we had the dumbed-down version instead of this one, because it would have helped me tremendously. I have some questions and then some observations and then maybe some things that we can talk about. But I'm just going to go from front to
Okay.
back, because as you can see, I've got some yellow tabs in here. So, but going through on page, and I'm just going to go by the page numbers of this, page 13, the first section, facilities. This is a question, because this money's already been spent, but at the Judicial Center, it appears we've spent $185,000 for Superior Court personnel. And I wonder, I didn't know we were responsible for Superior Court. And, you know, why did we get reimbursed for that?
I don't know that we're reimbursed for it, but we're responsible for the court simply because, as I understand, historically, you did not want the residents of Rocky Mount to have to go to Tarboro, I think it is, to receive court services. So in that whole process of setting up court, if you will, in its current location, we assumed the responsibility for all of the operations as well as the maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of whether or not state aid comes back to the city for any of that, I'd have to ask Ken about that. But if it is, it certainly doesn't cover the cost of the operations.
Right. There's a small amount of aid that we receive from the state for the operation of courts, and that's pretty much a consistent annual amount. And that really does not cover the costs associated with the maintenance or the upfit of any of the court facilities. That's been the case as long as I've been here.
So clarification, we have Superior Court in Rocky Mount?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it was in Tarboro or Nashville.
No, I think we have Superior Court here. You have resident judges here.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, that was the question, but, let's see.
Well, because didn't we just replace the roof on the Judicial Center?
We have done roof work there over the last couple of years, and we actually launched a feasibility study because it is an old building, of course. It is functional, but it's a struggle, particularly the magistrate court areas, the areas for both clerks, because you have to have a clerk for Edgecombe as well as a clerk for Nash housed there. So we did have a study done of the feasibility of the existing building, as well as trying to determine, well, what would be the replacement cost for that facility.
Well, along with what he's asking about, that was going to be part of my question with that, because I see $8 million in future years for that Judicial Center. And since downtown is a focus of the city, and we're trying to get as many people downtown as possible, I would like to see the exploration of and the study of building or renovating a building downtown for that purpose of the judicial center, to get a mass of people down there to support the businesses and the work and investment that taxpayers have put in downtown. So in $8 million, we're spending $4 million on a fire station. I don't know construction costs, but I would imagine $8 million could certainly come close to doing some damage.
Actually, the $8 million figure is taken from the study that has been done, and that was to repair what we have currently. To build a new judicial center, at that time was estimated to be at least twice that cost.
But regardless, I still would be interested in learning more about building or doing something downtown with the judicial center. So if I can just keep on going through this, I don't know how you want. Page 41, the cemetery software, it seems like a lot of money for software, $50,000 a year, and then creeping up to $100,000, and then $50,000 remaining of that. And I understand software is expensive. Maybe I don't understand exactly what it's doing for the cemetery, except for maybe I would assume you can look up where plots are and so forth, more of a database. That seems pricey to me.
It's based on, I believe, what they have been looking at this software for a couple of years, and that was based on based on the products that were available at the time. We will go back and we will definitely be going back and evaluating it. That's why we delayed it out into future years. We definitely need to find a solution going forward, and we're hoping that we can implement something in '23. But we will certainly reevaluate and see what our options are to find the most efficient and effective model that we can use for that. But it is more than just a database. There's a mapping component to it as well. There's also some implementation costs that we factored into this as well, because as part of this, there's going to need to be some surveying of our cemeteries and ensuring that all the plots are properly mapped, ensuring all the names. I mean, we have records, we have information, but this is to do a full comprehensive reevaluation to make sure everything is the way it should be.
Okay.
On that,
Yes.
I'm quite sure to bring things up to date, it's going to cost some money to do that. And any citizens who relatives or friends are buried in a city cemetery will want to be able to pick up the phone or either go to the cemetery office, and they can easily find where the person is, and also the mapping as well. So
Right.
I don't know if, as far as the software, but when you look at our IT, we had already talked about how we were behind in some of the technology in the city. And remember when we had that ransomware. So when we talk about software, I think that we need to make sure that we do what we can to at least to be in the 21st century and to be in line with other cities with technology. I think that's what happened with us in the past, that we had been where we had some antiquated software, antiquated technology or whatever. So again, I think it's a good thing. And just a note on the Judicial Center, Councilman Daughtry, we had already, when I say we, the city, and the former city manager and the current city manager had spoken about in reference to the Judicial Center being located in the downtown area. The first thing was to build the event center, and the second, or the next largest CIP was to look at relocating that in our downtown area to bring people in our downtown area. And we also know that the old May Gorham School on Coker Road was costing the city a lot of money for repair, and it's hard to maintain. And so really to bring that building up to speed for our court and for the clerk of court office is going to take a lot of money. So it's probably cheaper and better for us to build a new facility. And I think that we had talked about that a few years, and I don't know if you was part of that conversation last year, but it was mentioned. And that's one thing that we were looking at, but we wanted to get the event center built first. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate the comment about the database and so forth, and I do value the need to find loved ones. That half of my family's buried in Rocky Mount, so I can appreciate that. I'm going from my knowledge and expertise of my company is actually designing software, and that's where I'm coming from on this money. If you go to page 45, the desktop laptop replacement, $250,000 a year. And is that just the desktops and laptops? And how many do we have deployed out there? And I know you need to replace those on a annual basis. Well, I would say every 2 or 3 years, I would imagine. I don't know what the city's policy is, but how many units do we have out there? Because if we're spending $2,000 a unit, then we're buying 125 units a year, and I would imagine that with the volume that we buy, we probably purchase them a whole lot less than that. So I'm wondering why we're budgeting that much money if it's just laptops and desktops. If it's more than that, I can understand.
Well, it's a pretty significant inventory that we have, and our replacement schedule is 2 to 3 years, depending on the amount of the equipment is used. We do still have a sizable number of desktop units that we have in offices, and of course, we also have a lot of laptop units or mobile units now. A lot of us have migrated over to the Surface, but it is a pretty significant number. Greg, how many units do we?
We have over 800 units total, desktop, laptop, and tablet.
So that 800, you're right. I mean, it's a significant amount of money, but it's for a significant amount of equipment.
Okay, well, that explains it. Thank you.
Yep.
Organization size, I don't think that's too out of line.
It's not.
You got, and I'm speaking from that in terms of,
Well, where I'm coming from, and I hear what you're saying, but where I'm coming from, if we've got 847 staff members that Madam Manager's responsible for, I wouldn't imagine all 847 have computers, and that's where I was coming from in my mind, so I needed clarification. They just explained that we have
Right.
800 and some, so it makes sense, I understand it.
okay, all right. Thank you for the background. When you was going to be asked that question.
Well, this
That's why
is,
we have the directors
Yeah,
so they
yeah,
can drill down and tell you.
this is the time to ask questions. If you don't ask questions, you won't know, and I've got to approve a budget or not approve a budget, so I need to be knowledgeable of it.
That's right.
Page 56, and this is about the buses, and I've mentioned this to Madam Manager before, and I'm mentioning this to this city council. I would like for us to look at how much transit costs us. Costs us in the fact of charging fees, counting the money, the accounting that goes along with that. And the reason I say that is, and also the usage of our transportation, because I would be a proponent if it made sense. In my mind, the usage probably doesn't justify all the manpower it takes to keep the funds up of collecting fees. And we have a population in Rocky Mount that I think could benefit from the transit service, and it's an expense already. And I would be a proponent of, just like we have during COVID, to suspend fees, and hopefully that would increase the ridership on our public transportation. We've got the expense already. We have, I think, federally mandated we have to offer transportation. And I think it would be something for us to explore and to look at, in addition to maybe run, and I don't know how this is done during, when we have tournaments and so forth, but having transportation going from the hotels all around to the event center, to the Imperial Center, to the mill, to all the places, so we can increase the sales tax in the city and the usage of the Imperial Center and of the Event Center. And I think it would be something to explore, and if that's already happening, please let me know. But if we're getting a grant for $200,000 so we can take the fare box, I would just be curious if we could look at that.
We can.
And that's something I think it's worth, especially for this city, to explore.
Yeah, so I think it would probably be instructive to just give a quick overview of how the transit system is funded,
Yes.
and the federal resources in particular. So I don't know if you want to do that, or Brad.
I can
Okay,
give it a
go
shot,
ahead.
and if there's any questions, Brad
And
can
if we
follow up.
can also, a lot of people really don't know the reach and the function of our transit system and how it really serves not just Rocky Mount,
Right,
but look at how it serves a regional area.
absolutely. And before I preface this, I'll take a moment, I apologize. My first job in government was in public transit in Nashville, Tennessee. So it's something that I'm pretty familiar with from that experience, and continued on here in Rocky Mount. So it's a layered service because of the nature of what our responsibilities are as the provider, as well as the nature of the way it's funded. Because modern public transportation for a city like Rocky Mount is heavily dependent upon federal funding. That's how it's made possible. And that's how it's made possible for cities all across the country and regions all across the country. First is the more traditional service that people know of. We call it urban service or standard fixed route service. There is, of course, revenue generated from rider fees, but if you looked at it as a total revenue associated with cost, it's not significant. The revenues are primarily come from federal sources. The federal government pays 50% of the operating cost, and that would be your drivers, that would be management and planning. Then they also cover 80% of your capital, which is all maintenance. So it's not just the purchase of equipment, it's also any type of maintenance, including oil changes, tire replacements, all those types of things. The state is also a grant participant in North Carolina, so they contribute 25% to operations and 10% to capital. And then the city is only responsible in terms of the match for 25% of operations and 10% of capital. So we leverage a significant amount of federal and state funds to make that service possible. Then you have another service that we provide, which is given a variety of names: paratransit, STS, which includes the rural route services that we provide throughout the Twin Counties region, services that we provide to contracted services that we have to various groups like Twin County Industries, as well as to the various social service agencies here in Nash and Edgecombe County, and other services. That receives a significant amount of federal and state funding. The city itself does not provide funding for those services. No general fund monies go to those services. But the main source of revenue for those services are the contracts that we have to provide those services to the different providers. They pay for those services as well as receiving additional state and federal funding for support. So and of course, during the council meeting on the 28th, you'll see all the various project ordinances that we have to do that in order to manage all the grants associated with it. In reality, it's the grant management that's the significant, the cost that we incur with respect to management of these programs. A lot more goes to grant management than it does to managing fares and managing fare collections. There's a little bit of cost associated with that, but the real cost is in grant management. So that's really, in a brief but hopefully comprehensive version, the nature of our transit operations here in Rocky Mount. And our staff does a great job of making it all work and trying to provide that service to a wide number of residents throughout, not just Rocky Mount, as you said, but also throughout the Twin Counties.
Question, and the fee is not that astronomical, correct?
That is correct.
It's minimal.
Yes.
And one thing we mentioned when we got our new bus line, that we wanted to appeal to all citizens in Rocky Mount. We just had this short period of gas shortage. Just say, for instance, we had something like that. We want our transit system to be attractive and also affordable, and have all sector of our citizenship riding our transit bus. When you go to larger cities, you see from white collar, blue collar workers, from just the, children, students, college students, even with the MARTA and the subway. So we don't want to, we want to keep our fee where it's affordable minimum, but we don't want it to be a total, I don't think, to keep our transit system with the money we do have, attractive and appealing as well. So I understand, I think you were saying, as far as the fee, not charge a fee.
And that's a trend going throughout cities today, is not charging a fee.
Well, I haven't been to the city. I always have to put my card in a little machine to get a card and get on the transit or the subway.
And I appreciate that. I'm just of the opinion we shouldn't charge a fee if it's based off just a little revenue that we generate from that. So I can appreciate where you're coming from, and I hope you do the same with me.
Before you leave, I think your comment about using transit or bus services to, excuse me, help encourage people to park in larger parking areas in the city, transports people to and from the event center. Actually, when the event center opened, we put a pilot out there to test that. And what we found is people preferred to not use it. So that's why we didn't continue with that. But we actually had parking sites already set up, encouraging people to park, even here in City Hall and out to the sports complex. And we had buses lined up to encourage people to not congest the downtown area around the event center. But unfortunately, it didn't work, so we stopped it.
Right.
Well, that's more functional when you have large groups, massive people coming into the city at one time. Just a day-to-day operation, it makes no sense.
So we did attempt to see if it would work.
Yeah, I do recall that. That's interesting that's what happened. On page 134, surface transportation, and sidewalk construction on 135, I'm going to be a proponent that we put more money in that, because we have, how many miles? 290, almost 300 miles of roads that we maintain as a city. And I appreciate the amount of money that we're putting in there now. And I think it's doing, I think the citizens appreciate it. I'm hearing a lot from people out there. And there's a lot of roads that we need to maintain, and it's going to take a long time to get these roads up to snuff, so to speak, if we only spend the 1.6. And then we also sidewalks throughout this entire city. And I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, Sunset Avenue, not including what's getting ready to be done for the exit, but also over there by the Walmart and the mall, and there's a lot of people over there, and it's a safety issue, and I would certainly be a proponent of finding funds to help that out. So, let's see. I'm going to try to go through this as quick as possible, and I apologize, but I've got a lot of. A lot of it's in the surface transportation. I just say we need to add more money into that. And then going to energy resources and the electric piece, and Mr. Jones, who was here the other day, I think touched on it a little bit. But I would like, Madam Manager, for us to look at, and I know there's a lot involved, but there was mention about solar, but also coupled with that, I think, and it's not an inexpensive undertaking, but I think the benefits could help out tremendously, from what I understand, is the batteries, where you couple, you can either take the offload power that we generate to charge the batteries, coupled with solar if you so choose. But I do think it could potentially lower our utility rates even more from where we are. I don't know enough to speak intelligently about it, but I know enough that we should certainly investigate it and maybe we do pay in Kempa or whomever to I don't know how much we pay them, but we pay them, and I'm sure they've got the study and can look at our stuff and do that. And I think it would be beneficial for the city and for our residents. And I don't know where that needs to go in the CIP, but I'd like to see that. And then just curious, it's not a huge amount of money, but the fuel tank here at City Hall, the trend nowadays is, and that's on page 190, I think that's what it says, is not to bury due to the leaks and so forth. It's just like at airports. Airports have everything above ground now. So, and I don't need an answer on that. It's just more of I think the trend now is to put everything above ground. And I would imagine would be cheaper. I think.
To the solar, at one
Yes.
point, we had asked about, we had our former utilities director about solar farms. We know that some of the county, or neighboring counties were doing solar farms. And at that time, we were pretty much using where we would get a percentage off if you have the gauges or the equipment on your hot water heater and so forth and so on. And we weren't really looking into solar. And listening to Roy from Electric Cities that came here was saying the piece about the solar. So if we're gonna look more in depth about solar, would it be advantageous for us? That would come off the price of what we are paying wholesale. I know we have some land that's near our sewer plant. We have a lot of farmland that could possibly be used for solar that could also help defray some of their costs.
Fortunately for y'all, I think I'm towards the end of my questions. And I think last night I only could get to page 285, and I had an opportunity to get further than that, so. So anyway, just some thoughts, but I would like to see us spend more on that the surface sidewalks and our roads. And then I really would like for us to look into the transit system.
You have a thought for where we move those expenditures from, that money?
There are a lot of things that we disagree on where money's going, so you could imagine I would say move some of that money from things that we're spending on to that would benefit a lot of folks. And one thing I did not mention that's not in here is there's nothing in there for the Ward 5, anything in there for park or community center or anything in there. So.
Hold it. I do want to make, and maybe Brad Carr can address this, if not Mr. Hunter, for us, our dirt streets in the next fiscal year. I think we had how many miles of dirt streets left? I know we paid a lot, and Councilmember Miller, someone thanked us for doing the freer road. You know, that we brought that up, and you said you didn't really have any people complaining about it, but they do appreciate it, because we paved that. Could you tell us how much, how far as mileage of dirt roads we still have in the city limits?
So it can be recorded. Say that the department heads, when they're asked to come forward, please
Yeah,
come to the mic
unfortunately,
so
I
it can be
didn't- I
recorded. Yeah.
Didn't have that one to memory, so I think it's in the 8-mile range. I have a report on it, I can get it and report back to you, but, so we have that we're picking at it. We're already working on designs for the next fiscal year for two more dirt street projects.
So when,
Let me just get that rather than guess. It would be, but.
so, excuse me. So when we pave a dirt road, then it goes into our inventory of improved or paved streets. Does that increase our allocation of funds from the power bill or from any other source?
It increases our potential share, yes.
Yes, okay. So theoretically, then, we get more money to upkeep those streets.
Yes, if the revenue total goes up, and that's the challenge with the Powell bill that we've had, is the source of revenue that is there. We are expecting some increase this year due to vehicle sales, because it's a combination of gas revenue and vehicle sales, gas tax revenue and vehicle sales. But obviously, the challenge, there's two challenges. One, there's the revenue source, which is an ongoing challenge in transportation funding in general. And then the second is the fact that it's our share of the total statewide inventory that's controlled by local governments. And so it's all a ratio. And so there's the potential for it. It doesn't hurt us. It certainly helps us. But I don't want to come back and say that we get less money from one year to the next, and that'd be the case. So we try our best to make it work.
With regard to keeping our roads or bringing them up to standard, they deteriorate faster than we get money to repair and replace them. Isn't that correct, resurfacing? I mean, they move from streets that are in poor condition to streets that just need to be reconstructed.
I would believe, based on what we have shown in the past with our pavement condition surveys, that would be correct.
Right. Thank you.
I hope for, and I don't know if we could do it or not, that when we look at the solar process, I remember the incentive programs we had for people to upgrade equipments and different things in their homes, and they got some incentive to do so. If we can ever do anything with the solar, where people can reduce their utility bills and possibly be able to sell utilities back, I think most of us would rather be selling it than buying it. So I think if any opportunity we can make available for our citizens to do that, I think it would be great.
Isn't the issue the rate at which Duke or whomever pays for the power that we might generate and provide to them?
I thought I heard the other night from Mr. Jones that it's now, we could, if we changed what we did here at the city, and please correct me, someone, if I'm wrong, that you could actually use what you create, and whatever you didn't use, you could sell back to, put back into the generation. Is that correct or not correct? So, because used to you have to sell everything back, I thought.
I'm not quite sure. Chris, are you familiar enough with this to address that question?
While he's coming up, I was going to just ask if he, at some point, would just bring us information in reference to that for citizens who want to have solar panels, if we want to sell it back versus being able to power our home. And how can that help mitigate some of that money that we do pay for our wholesale power? But I'm not asking you to answer that now, but I think we need various information that we can study and take a look at what would be most advantageous for us as a city and for our constituents. Thank you.
I was just going, it's on our website under renewable energy policy.
I had remembered that there was something that we had done many years ago. I think it was part of what was going on with the energy credit program and some of the set-asides that were required of utility producers. That was done back, I think, around 2010, 2011. That was done in that. And so I think that policy was in effect. But certainly, I think we also would need to reexamine that policy as well.
Too, if I install 5 panels on top of my house, how is that going to reduce, or what, the calculation?
Right.
Right.
And clearly, a lot of the dealers who've started getting into it the dealers that'll get into it will kind of explain that as well.
To we just hope that we would be far enough ahead of it to really educate our citizens on the process and have some incentives from the city to help citizens to participate.
We'll look at that.
Absolutely.
No other questions? Thank you, City Manager.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We will now move to the next presentation, which is on the proposed revenue projections for fiscal year 2022.
Thank you very much again. So the purpose of this is actually to start getting into the budget book, and this information is covered in section 2, the budget in brief, starting on page 2-5. We'll go through this summary. The summary will cover each of our annually appropriated funds. And obviously, the information you'll see on the charts on the screen are summarized, but obviously we'll be happy to answer any questions with respect to any particular revenues that are identified in the revenue summary, which again begins on page 2-5. To kind of start off with some highlights, we like to try to give some explanation as we move forward with this. Obviously, as one of the reasons why, if you notice, when we did this budget report, normally we only include the most recent full fiscal year, which in this case would be 2020, but we actually included the past 2 fiscal years, 2019 and 2020. And the reason we did that was we wanted to really show where we were before 2020, because obviously 2020 was affected in the final quarter due to COVID. And we thought it was important because obviously COVID has not just affected our operations, but obviously it's had considerable impact on the economy in general. And there are some trends that we have noticed, and some of these trends are maybe shorter term, but obviously we believe some of these trends are longer term. And we've definitely tried to look at what's being suggested by people at the Richmond Fed and the Federal Reserve, Wells Fargo Economics Group out of Charlotte, Dr. Michael Walden at North Carolina State University. We try our best to look at what those particular sources of information are saying, and as well as other notable sources that are out there. And what we saw, particularly with respect to COVID, is we saw an economic shift from services to goods. In terms of consumer behavior, there had been a large shift over the last 20 or so years to more of a service-based economy. However, due to COVID and the issues of lockdowns and social distancing, a lot of service-oriented spending was suspended. Now, that had some negative impacts on the economy, and particularly in terms of those businesses and jobs associated with the service industry. Here locally, we've seen that in the hospitality industry, in terms of the job losses in the hospitality industry. But at the same time, you also saw a significant increase in goods consumption that occurred as well. We also saw the explosion of online retail. And this could have been significantly challenging for us, as well as for other localities throughout North Carolina, if it had not been for the Wayfair decision a couple of years back, which made online sales tax applicable. So because of the Wayfair decision, which meant that whether you buy from Amazon or from any major online retailer, that the state sales tax is being applied, that put us in a position to be able to actually see an increase in our sales tax revenues as opposed to an anticipated decrease. And as I'll explain a little later, we were very cautious as we went into this fiscal year because we simply did not know how the dynamics of the sales tax were going to react to what was going on with COVID. We simply did not know. We have also seen an increased housing demand. Individuals, obviously, who have shifted to work from home, which does appear to have significant long-term staying power in a lot of professions, have started rethinking their residential plans, and that has led to significant demand for residential housing, single-family housing, expanded housing throughout the country. And we have seen, and including in the Triangle, and we also are starting to see that triangle, we have seen in the last year that Triangle activity extend into Rocky Mount more. It was starting to before COVID, but it has really taken off just in the past year. Obviously, at the same time, what has been also an aspect to the pandemic and the response to the pandemic has been this continuous deluge of multiple rounds of federal stimulus funding, some of which we've been able to receive directly as a city. Obviously, a lot more that has gone out to individual citizens through a variety of programs, as well as to businesses and other organizations. So it helped lessen the blow overall for a lot of citizens. Personal savings rates increased over 20% due to this income surge. And at the same time, we still need to work to address the challenges that have been created by significant unemployment and distress. We obviously saw significant unemployment increases in unemployment as a result of COVID policy, and we have not yet dug ourselves out of that hole, and that will continue to happen, and hopefully we'll see we'll be in a lot better position here in the next several months. Overall, our housing market has strengthened significantly and continues to grow. The challenge really here locally, as it is in pretty much every desirable market in the country, is supply. There's a limited amount of existing supply, and construction supply and new construction is being stymied partially by construction labor limitations, also by material cost. You've heard about the increases in lumber and other building materials, and a lot of builders are simply holding off on building because they obviously don't want to see issues with respect to their economics and dynamics in terms of the cost of a home purchase, buying it, and the possibility and what that will deal with appreciation once the home's occupied. Of course, this last aspect is the American Rescue Plan. We, of course, are going to be receiving $11.5 million as a city. The first 50% will be received to us relatively soon. We will receive and appropriate it before the end of this fiscal year. And then the other 50% will be received 12 months after that. We continue to evaluate the regulations that have come down. Early last week, we received the interim final rule from the Department of Treasury. It's about a 150-page document, and it kind of explains what the uses are, and it kind of provides more explanation. The department, and it's still, even with that much volume, it still has some vagueness to it. It's really a challenge to make sure we get it right. And our intentions are to appropriate this as a project ordinance, to receive it and to appropriate it as a project ordinance like we've done with other federal funding allocations, and to have that appropriated by council probably on June 28th. And then we will start planning how the utilization of those funds. We'll have 4 years to utilize the funds. So we'll have a significant period of time to use the funds.
That appropriation would be a lump sum that would later be allocated over various projects, is that correct?
Yes, it'll go towards multiple projects. It won't all go into one.
Yeah, so the idea would be, first of all, is to appropriate the funds, put it in our fund balance as such. I have gone on record several times saying that I would recommend a set aside for affordable housing in the amount of $3 million, but that's just to kind of give you a heads up of what my recommendation would be for the use of a portion of it. Although we still have other issues to talk about as it relates to the Housing Strategic Plan, most notably the Community Land Trust. But at least by setting aside a portion of it, the council has operating funds to advance any housing initiatives that we want to start working on in anticipation of a future housing bond. So as Ken said, it's lots of paper, lots of words, a great deal of vagueness to it, but I just think it's important that we just go ahead and lock the funds in our savings account, if you will, and then at a future time be specific about how it is that the council would like to expend those funds.
So also to talk about, obviously, this rescue plan also includes additional household supplemental payments and tax credits. The next round actually are the advanced payments of child tax credits, which I think will take effect in June or July, and families will receive those. The child tax credit was increased significantly, and then they're going to advance payment, which is not something that typically happens with tax credits, but it will happen in this case. And this, of course, that plus the impact of the fact that there's a lot of money that's been sitting in people's bank accounts will, of course, result in an unleashing of pent-up demand. And we've seen that in the housing market, and we may see that in other sectors of the economy. And one other thing that we are seeing, of course, is higher inflation. And obviously, the report back from April is that we were over 4% on a 12-month basis nationally, and that was also holding true for the Mid-Atlantic region. But that may subside a little bit, but we would anticipate that at the end of this year, inflation would be in the neighborhood between 3% and 4%. So obviously, not for those who are familiar historically with the 70s, not to where it was back then, but certainly more significant than what we've experienced over the last 20 years, where inflation has typically been in the 2 to 3% range. So I want to talk about general fund revenues at this point. And so the first one is our current year ad valorem. This is real property tax that's primarily collected on real estate as well as on personal property. And as you can see, we are proposing for fiscal year 2022 about $24.7 million, which is an increase of $150,000 over what we adopted for fiscal year 2021. You'll notice that the projection of what we anticipate to actually collect this year is around 24.1, and that's due to a small decrease in the collection rate. And real estate was an area that, as we went into COVID, we were not really sure how the performance would be. At the time that we entered, in last year, our collection rate was in around the 96% range. And so we were kind of anticipating that collections would kind of be around 95, 96%, and we were down to 94. The state requires that when we move forward in the next year that we maintain the collection rate that we expect for this current year. So this 24.7 is based on a 94% collection rate, which we anticipate improving upon next year as we see economic conditions improve. But we also build in about a 2.5% increase in valuations, and we feel pretty confident about that given the nature of the real estate market as well as the economic growth and development that is taking place here in the present and what has taken place in the last year. So we feel pretty confident that we'll hit the $24.7 million number in fiscal year 22. Other ad valorem revenues, and the bulk of this is actually the vehicle tax. We budget at $6,012,200, which is about $720,000 more. That's almost entirely from the vehicle tax. Vehicle tax has performed very well the last couple of years. Collections have improved dramatically over the last several years due to the Tax and Tag Together program. Prior to that, vehicle taxes were paid to the county as part of a mail-in, and the collections were just not very successful. We've dramatically improved the collection rate. Plus, we've seen a lot of vehicle purchases in the last several years, so we've definitely seen improvement there, and we feel pretty certain about the collections in that area. Local option sales tax. As you can see, for fiscal 22, we're budgeting $15.1 million, which is almost $3.7 million more than what we budgeted last year, or this current fiscal year. And I got to move over here just a second because I want to make sure I see the screen. But as you can see, when we look at 2019, we were looking at around $12.5 million. And if you remember back in March, April of last year, as we were forecasting the end of last year, and we were forecasting fiscal year 2021, we were anticipating about a 25% drop in sales tax revenues due to a lockdown. And again, that was a very conservative, worst-case assessment. But again, it was because, given the circumstances of the environment, we simply did not know what was going to happen, and we did not want to be in a position of over-budgeting the revenue in that area. As you can tell by the projection that we have for the end of fiscal year 21, we're anticipating $14.8 million. So what's really happened is that revenue from the sales tax has grown significantly, online sales as well as purchase of goods. There's a lot more services in North Carolina that are also subject to sales tax than there were about 5, 6 years ago. Plus, there's the continuation of the redistribution, the 2080 redistribution that was passed by the legislature about 3 years ago. So all those conditions have worked to our advantage. And as you can see, we're anticipating 14.8. We see a small amount of increase above that, only about 2% for fiscal year 22. And again, that's conservative, but we feel pretty confident about that $15.1 million for next fiscal year. When it comes to other intergovernmentals, we're looking at about 6.627, which is relatively flat compared to this year. And about half of that comes from the franchise tax, which is the sales tax on electricity, which has been pretty consistent at about $3.65, $3.7 million. So we've been pretty consistent in that area. And we anticipate that remaining consistent for fiscal year 22. Licenses and permits, again, relatively consistent, $1,566,000. Really didn't see any decline in that as a result of COVID. It actually went up a little bit above projection, but we want to remain, kind of be consistent on that. Sales and services, 11.204. And you can see there's over $1 million, look at it, just look at it real quick. Of that, about 842,000 of that is tied to the revenue we anticipate to collect from the increase in the environmental services fee. And you see that on page 2-6. We anticipate about $842,000 generated from the $3 increase to the residential solid waste fee, which we are recommending for the implementation of the expansion of services into year-round leaf collection and litter collection. So that's where the majority of that $1 million comes from. Interest earnings, as you can see, have declined significantly. We're only budgeting $295,520. And again, as we talked about in the message that we shared, that the city manager shared with you on Monday, this is the effect of what's gone on in the credit markets with respect to the Federal Reserve intervention. And it's a much broader intervention than what we even saw following the real estate and stock market crash in 2008, as it's gone into a much broader range of securities. And when that happens, of course, it minimizes the return on the investments that we make to the capital management trust, and as such dramatically reduces our interest revenue. And you will see that across all the funds, because we obviously do invest a significant share of our available resources into those funds to try to at least make something off of them. So this is something we've seen before, and we anticipate this being a long-term issue in terms of with respect to revenues. Miscellaneous, which is rents, contributions, and other revenues that we collect, we're anticipating $690,600, about $69,150 of that. It's an increase of $69,150, and there are some event center revenues tied into that we do see some improvement on. Transfers in, those are the transfers from our enterprise funds as well as the occupancy tax, and we're only anticipating about $3.1 million, which means it goes down by about $450,000. We've talked about lease and loan proceeds going up to $7.498 million, which is a significant increase, and we've talked about what we plan to use with that. And then the fund balance appropriated, we budgeted 1.7 this current fiscal year. We don't anticipate using any of that this current fiscal year. As you can see, currently the amended is around $5.7 million, but we do not anticipate, we anticipating using very little fund balance to balance this current fiscal year. And we're looking at starting off next fiscal year with about $2.25 million appropriation in fund balance. And our goal hopefully will be to obviously do our best to recover expenses and see growth in revenue beyond projection to be able to avoid having to use that money in fiscal year 22. Total budget for the general fund is $78,684,350, which is a $12.495 million increase compared to the current fiscal year. But again, as I wanted to say, it's important to understand that when we budgeted for fiscal year 21, we budgeted significantly below where we were for fiscal year 20. So this, I'm not saying it's purely catch up. There's some growth there, but it's also the fact that we do want to kind of show that we're trying to recover from those decisions that we had to make in this current fiscal year due to COVID. With respect to the Powell Bill Fund, you will note that it does go down, and the most significant reason it goes down is because the transfer of vehicle permit fees does not get transferred over to Powell Bill. It stays in the general fund for surface transportation. They'll be paid for out of the general fund. You can see the revenues here. We've budgeted for the Powell Bill allocation at $1.65 million. State grants, $734,000. Most of that's tied to the CMAQ sidewalk improvements, receipt of funds for those improvements. Only about $4,000 in interest earnings, and $36,000 in various assessments for work and other miscellaneous revenues that are accounted for in that fund. Total budget for Powell Bill in fiscal year 22 to start off with is $3,088,000, which compared to last year's a decrease of about $1.3 million. Emergency telephone, which is our E911 system. The primary source of this is an appropriation, as an allocation of E911 revenues that's provided to us by the state from the statewide E911 tax. That number there for FY22 proposed at $308,160 was provided to us just a couple of weeks ago by the state as our allocation. As you can see, it's a significant decline compared to 21, a decline of about $79,240. We did look at overall at our expenses for this. The way that we can use these funds is fairly limited. It's primarily on equipment and service contracts. We don't use it to pay for telecommunicators. We don't pay it to use for staffing. That's all paid for out of the general fund. So we are able to kind of keep our expenses in line with this. We're only requesting to balance to make sure that we have the appropriate funding, about a $16,800. And I apologize, that should be $16,840, not what it says there. It's $16,8470. It should be $16,840, and total budget for the fiscal year of $325,000. With respect to the electric fund, for all of our utilities, we do work significantly to evaluate revenues. Obviously, the bulk of the revenues that is received in the utilities comes from sales. We work with external and forecasters as well as do internal forecasting and evaluation on a monthly basis to see where we are with respect to revenues and also with respect to cost. And that's especially true with electric and gas because we are reselling a wholesale commodity in both cases. On the electric fund side, our revenues really don't change all that much. We're anticipating revenues of about $75,750,000. As you can see here from other sales and services, which are various other expenses, various ways that we collect revenue, about $760,000. Again, only $15,000 in interest. And based on our CIP recommendation, $1.865 million in lease and loan proceeds, as well as $2.5 million in fund balance for a total of $80,895,000, which is still about $1.46 million than we budgeted last year. On the gas side, again, our revenues are relatively stable at $21,950,000. Other sales and services, $335,000, $7,500 in investment earnings, $150,000 for lease and loan proceeds. Pretty much the only item that we finance in the gas fund is equipment. All the other improvements have to be paid for in cash, unless we do massive improvements like the last one we did. I think it was for Pfizer, was something that we were able to do with financing, but normally with our gas improvements, they have to be done with cash. And $1.875 in fund balance for a total of $24,318,000. On the water fund side, overall water fund revenues have looked good this year compared to some prior years. We're conservatively estimating about $10.8 million in revenues this current year, and costs have been adjusted to be able to adjust for that. And we're proposing that revenues remain steady at about $11,325,000 in other sales and services, investment in earnings of $5,000, $105,000 in miscellaneous, $405,000 in interest and loan proceeds, and $1.23 million in fund balance for a total of $13,077,200 for the water fund. On the sewer fund side, we've actually increased our revenues a little bit. The primary, of course, is regular sewer sales at about $13,050,000. We also have two other significant revenue sources. Our surcharges, which are related to primarily industrial and commercial customers that they pay with respect to their treatment, as well as resale customers. We generate about $600,000 a year. We actually are projecting 760, but we keep that flat with respect that a lot of that can be driven by weather events. In terms of our leachate, which is a service that we developed a couple of years ago that primarily deals, our primary customer for leachate is the landfill that we dispose of our trash in Bertie County. We're estimating about $750,000 in revenue. So those two revenues combined are an additional $1.35 million in revenue, along with the revenue we generate from just general sewer usage. $213,000 in other sales, $5,000 in investments, $180,000 in miscellaneous, $1.5 million in lease and loan. Most of that is going to the Old Mill Road pump station, and a little over $1 million in fund balance for a total of $17,373,530. And then last but not least is the stormwater fund revenues. The revenues, of course, from stormwater come from the ERU charge, and obviously we anticipate that revenue to grow a little bit as the amount of developed land inside the city grows with ongoing development, both residential, industrial, and commercial. Utility sales are estimated at about $4.11 million, 127 in other sales. Again, small amount in investment earnings at $2,500, $25,000 in miscellaneous, $650,000, and again, this is all equipment. The $650,000 that we're proposing is in lease proceeds, is all equipment related, and $530,000 in fund balance for a total of $5,445,000. So all that information is further detailed in pages 2-5 to 2-10 of the budget in brief, and that concludes this portion of the presentation.
Any questions at this point?
I was just saying, just based on your projections and the logic behind it, it feels like a fairly conservative revenue budget. Do you feel that way?
I do.
Yeah. If I had any criticism, it would be the inflation rates, but, we don't know what we don't know.
That's the challenge. Because the challenge with inflation is, you see it, but at the same time, you don't know how it's going to affect overall activity. Because obviously, as we've seen with the construction, it delays activity, which hopefully does some degree to balance off the inflation, eventually slow it down. But at the same time, there is the possibility for increased activity, which as a result can increase revenues, particularly with respect to sales tax. But when it comes to revenues, we'd rather be safer on that end.
Well, that was my feeling as you're going through it. And
Right.
Clearly, you've done a lot of work, and congratulations on that, and thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Madam Manager, on the fees that we're going to change, whether it be for the residents, and that's been well, the increase of the $3, that's been well publicized, but I think there's some other fees, environmental services. I think it would be good for the folks that will be impacted, if they know those. I think historically, they don't really find out until they receive an invoice from the city. So if we could change that, and it's nothing, I think it's just maybe a change in, I think it's always been that way.
Well, I think when we start discussing more in detail the expenditures of the general fund, we'll have a more in-depth presentation to you to support the rate increase. And if at that time the council moves forward with the recommendation, then of course we will, put the word out as to what that rate might look like, as well as, obviously what impact it would have on the residents' budget for the year, which is very minimal. And I think there'll also be comparisons of what other municipalities are charging for collection rate as well. So we intend to go a little bit more in detail as to why the fee is necessary and exactly what it supports.
Oh, I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, just let folks know a little ahead of time before they get a bill. Ken, 2.2 on the fund balance, potentially, you mentioned to utilize, and currently the last report the city council received. January 21, we're at 18.9%. Fund balance about 12.5 million. I'm sure it fluctuates, but based if it stays constant, that'll bring the fund balance down to about 10.3. And in a quick percentage, that would bring us down to about 15.5%. Is that what you're calculating, or am I off?
That would be if we actually use the 5-point-something million, which we're not. We're not anticipating using any more than probably a couple $100,000 up to $1 million in fund balance this current fiscal year. So that initial number that we started off with as of June 30th will probably remain relatively the same, may go down just a little bit, then you would adjust the 2.25 off of that. So we'll be back up into the 20, we'll be back closer into the 20% range
Okay.
when we get to that point.
Yeah. And to include the rollover. So
Correct.
we're anticipating at the end of this fiscal year. Okay. Well, we anticipate closing out this fiscal year with funds that we haven't spent. And
Yes.
so that would just roll over into the fund balance and increase it.
But no, that is one of the challenges when you're evaluating it, is that you kind of have to then finish the end of the year, then come back, and then you kind of restart. But it doesn't mean that where we finish based on that number. So there will definitely be more than what it looks like right now at the beginning of next fiscal year.
Oh, no, we don't, no. Oh, we're very good at that, yeah.
I'm good, thank you.
Yes, sir. So, Ken, for the next budget work session, June 2nd?
Yes, and that'll be to cover the general fund as well as the enterprise fund expenditures.
All right, thank you all.
7 minutes over.
Oh, y'all had a bet on.
He asked me for the over-under.